Hello everyone. Our little talk tonight is going to be about a kingdom of incredibly diverse and surprising organisms. Fungi make us think of mushrooms, but mushrooms are just a kind of fruit, a fruit that bears spores created by a fungus. I will tell you about mushrooms, but there is much more to this topic. Fungi can be microscopic or enormous. They can grow in extreme environments on Earth, like deserts or deep-sea sediments. Some can even survive the intense cosmic radiation and UV radiation encountered in space. And they can also form bonds, associations with plenty of plants and animals. As many of you probably know, biologically they do not fit into the kingdom of plants, nor the kingdom of animals. We will see why and what distinguishes them. So we have a lot of things to discover. It is now time for you to take a deep breath, find a comfortable position, and off we go. Before we go into biology and definitions, I told you that their diversity of sizes could be extreme. Do you know that the most massive living organism on Earth could well be a fungus? In a forest of Oregon, the Malheur National Forest grows a species of fungus quite common to the western United States, Armillaria ostoi. But in this particular place, a giant specimen was identified, living mostly underground. It is several thousand years old and is estimated to cover 3.5 square miles, that's about 9 square kilometers, for a total weight estimated above 30,000 tons. For comparison, the biggest living animal on Earth is the blue whale, that can reach up to 200 tons. So here we are speaking of 150 adult blue whales in weight for this single specimen of fungus. You could walk in the forest without really seeing it. What is visible at the surface is its fruits, the mushrooms, that pop up in the autumn. But these are just the tip of an iceberg. It is believed that this fungus could reach such a size thanks to a favorable climate and low competition for land and nutrients. For that particular species of fungus, food is essentially trees that the fungus invades, growing under their bark. It stops water from circulating in the tree, which kills it very slowly. It can take up to 30 or 40 years, and it feeds on its wood, forming a white membrane under the bark that resembles latex, but it is a living organism. And we know it is the same fungus on such a vast area because in different places the tissues are connected, and DNA tests have revealed that samples taken several kilometers apart were from the same organism that keeps growing underground and appears on the surface to make mushrooms or feed on tree trunks. Now, all fungi are not that dangerous to trees. They are even necessary for trees to live and extract nutrients from the ground. We will see that later. Large fungi are also very ancient. Several 100 million years ago, during the Ordovician and Devonian periods, this was 470 to 360 million years ago, the largest land-dwelling organisms at the time, that we know of at least, were kinds of mushrooms that resembled tree trunks, 3 feet wide and up to 26 feet in length. That's 8 meters. They are known through terrestrial fossils, and the study of their fossilized tissues suggests that they were part of the fungus kingdom, even though their exact relationship with actual, extant fungus lineages is uncertain. So this raises a question. What are fungi exactly, if they are not animals nor plants? They don't fit in these categories because they are man-made categories, and historically, initially, they were based on mere observation. Generally, we easily distinguish an animal from a plant. Historically, the plant kingdom was defined by default. All living things that were not animals were categorized as plants, so that included all fungi and algae too. But it appeared that in some cases, things were more ambiguous. And in the modern period, when an effort was made to define these categories based on scientific evidence and criteria, it appeared that if we were to precisely define plants by a lot of common characteristics of their structure, including on a cellular level, not just visual observation, then fungi and some other organisms, like different types of algae, could not be considered part of the same kingdom together with plants. So, what is a plant? What is an animal? And what is a fungus? The traditional historical definition of plants as opposed to animals was made in the antiquity. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, distinguished plants that could generally not move from animals that were generally mobile to catch their food. This distinction, this way of categorizing, lasted well into modern times. The basis for the modern system of scientific classification of species was established in the 18th century by a Swedish botanist and zoologist, Carl von Linné. He named 2 kingdoms, Vegetabilia and Animalia, that basically formalized these 2 ancient categories that were based purely on visual observation. But then, along the 19th century, the discovery or the description of countless species, and also the study of the living with new instruments like microscopes and later DNA, this revealed that it was not that simple. There are many organisms, species, big and small, that did not fit into the plant and animal categories as defined by Carl von Linné. For example, but there are many examples, sponges. Externally, sponges look a lot like plants. They don't move to catch food. They don't even have a nervous or digestive or circulatory system. But they don't correspond to plants because they filter their food from the water they live in. And on a cellular level, they are close to animals, not plants. So they are classified as animals today. Sponges could be considered classified as animals, but there were other organisms that were too different from the plant and animal kingdoms to be classified in any of the two. This is why new kingdoms were established. Fungi was one of these new kingdoms, but not the only one. It could change again in the future, but as of today, the mainstream classification of living organisms begins with the distinction between two big families of species, based on the structure of their cells: Prokaryotes and Eukaryotes. Prokaryotes include bacteria and archaea, two kinds of single-cell organisms. In the history of evolution, it is believed that they appeared first, and eukaryotes appeared later in several stages. The big difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes is that the cells of eukaryotes have a nucleus, and it is not always the case, but eukaryotes can also have several cells. All prokaryotes are single-cell organisms, whereas eukaryotes have this capacity to form larger bodies when an individual multiplies its cells. Eukaryotes are grouped into several branches. Plants are one of them, and so are animals and fungi. And there is a fourth group called Protista that serves as a catch-all for species that cannot be put into any of the three other groups. This is why I told you that this classification may evolve again in the future, because a catch-all category is useful, but not fully satisfying to understand the different branches of the living. The domain Protista includes thousands of species, often small, microscopic, like many amoebas, but not all of them are tiny. For example, giant brown algae seaweeds, also known as kelp, could be taken for an aquatic plant, but they are not. They are Protista organisms that are very distinct from plants on a cellular level. So, at this point, the kingdom of plants has been reduced to everything that wasn't animal centuries ago, to eukaryotes that predominantly practice photosynthesis, that is to say, that produce their food and organic material using the energy of sunlight. These are still tens of thousands of species, including land plants and green algae. The animal kingdom includes organisms that, with a few exceptions, consume organic material, that breathe oxygen, and that are able to move, at least during a stage of their life. Many marine animals move only at an early stage, and then they stay put. And they can also reproduce sexually. Animals include 1.5 million species that are described, but there is an estimated 7 million extant living animal species in total. And the fungus kingdom is separate because they don't fit into plants, they do not photosynthesize. They acquire their food by absorbing dissolved molecules, typically by secreting digestive enzymes around them into their environment. The fact that they digest food coming from the outside could make them animals, but they are not animals either, because they lack mobility. Their only way of moving is growing, except for their spores that get disseminated. But the spores are not the fungi themselves. They are just a mean of reproduction, carrying genetic information. We will see later that for fungi that produce mushrooms, the mushrooms are a way of disseminating their spores. And there are more differences with animals. Animals are generally able to respond quickly to external stimuli. They have nerves, muscles, or tissues that can contract. Fungi don't have that. Their only way to respond to changes in the environment is changing their direction of growth or their metabolism. But obviously this is much slower than a nervous or muscular reaction. Yet another difference is that fungi do not digest in a stomach. They don't have one. And finally, their cells are also different. Their cell walls contain chitin, that is to say, a complex molecule that is produced by many organisms. Chitin forms rigid surfaces. It is present in the exoskeletons of insects or crustaceans. It is the main component of their external armor. By its properties, its functions, it is close to the protein keratin. Keratin is naturally produced by many animal species, including humans. It is the main component of nails, hair, scales, feathers, even horns. A different molecule than chitin, a different polymer, but their functions are quite close. So fungi have chitin in their cell walls that makes them rigid. And this is a major biological difference with plants and animals. So, now that we have seen what differentiates fungi from other kingdoms, why they are their own kingdom, let's take a look at the different forms they can take, and also human interaction with some sorts of fungi, which is a good occasion to tell you about yeasts and molds. Not that humans have such a good knowledge and understanding of the fungi kingdom. It is very diverse and also a continent that remains largely unexplored by us. Fungi would include 2 to 4 million species. The most visible terrestrial ones are known, but only 150,000, so less than 10% of species in this kingdom, have been described scientifically. The branch of biology that studies fungi is called mycology, and the term appeared in the 19th century. But obviously the use of fungi as a source of food started in prehistoric times. Apart from directly eating mushrooms, a widespread use of fungi by humans since ancient times is for fermentation and bread making, using yeasts. What is yeast, or more exactly, what are yeasts? Because there are many. 1,500 species are currently described. But how do we know that there are fungi if they are made of a single cell? Well, as we have seen before, first because their cells have a nucleus, so that makes them eukaryotes, and then there is chitin in their cell walls, and this is typical of fungi. Yeasts are unicellular, but it is believed they evolved from multicellular ancestors. And a particularity of some yeast species is that they can assemble and develop multicellular characteristics, forming strings of connected cells, like a colony or a community of many individuals staying together. They are fungi, so their way of feeding is by secreting enzymes around them. An enzyme is a molecule that accelerates chemical reactions. It acts as a catalyst, and the chemical reactions rearrange molecules around them into material that they can absorb. This is the mechanism that makes yeast useful for fermentation. There is one species called Saccharomyces cerevisiae, better known as baker's yeast or brewer's yeast, that converts carbohydrates, sugars, to carbon dioxide and alcohol. Carbon dioxide and alcohol are subproducts, waste of its feeding cycle. These subproducts are what interests us as humans. Carbon dioxide is released as gas and forms tiny bubbles inside the dough of bread or cake. In the case of fermented drinks, like wine, this yeast produces alcohol, and also in the case of beer, the gas that makes beer bubbly. The mechanism remained unknown until microbiology explained it. But early on, men learned to cultivate that particular yeast, for example by keeping sourdough, even though they didn't really know or understand how it worked. All the fungus needs to multiply is an environment where it can feed. Flour or sugar are almost pure carbohydrates, and there are also carbohydrates in large quantities in cereals or fruits that are used for alcoholic beverages production. Their use is very ancient. When it comes to yeast-raised bread, drawings showing the making process have been found in Egypt and dated to 4,000 years ago. But the practice certainly appeared long before that. For alcohol, vessels as old as these Egyptian drawings were found in Israel. They were used to contain fermented beverages like beer and mead. And the study with microscopes revealed that the yeast colonies these vessels contained had survived thousands of years despite the absence of food. They had slowed down their metabolism, waiting for better days. This is the earliest direct biological evidence of yeast use in ancient cultures. It took a long time for scientists to understand the mechanism that made yeast active. Until the works of Pasteur in 1857, it was supposed that yeast was a chemical catalyst, not a living organism. The fast progress of microbiology in the second half of the 19th century helped understand how yeast worked. And since then, the reproduction cycle of yeast has also been explored. It can be sexual in rare cases. But most of the time, yeast reproduces asexually. Some yeasts can fission, that is to say, the cell cuts itself into two daughter cells that are identical. Or a more common way of asexual reproduction is by budding. This means that a small daughter cell, a bud, without nucleus, forms on the cell of an existing yeast. Then the nucleus of the parent cell splits, and half of it migrates into the daughter cell. The bud continues to grow, stuck to its mother cell, until eventually it reaches maturity and separates as a new cell. When it comes to human consumption, yeasts are almost always safe. They cannot harm us, but there is a small number of them that can be opportunistic pathogens and cause fungal infections. Opportunistic because infections happen almost only in people with a compromised immune system. It is fairly rare. Now, this being said, the contribution of yeast in our daily lives is not 100% positive. They can help produce food and enhance its texture or taste, but they can also spoil it. If yeast is present in food that contains sugars or other carbon sources that can be metabolized, plus the right conditions of temperature and acidity, yeasts like environments with low pH, 5 or lower. In these conditions, they can proliferate and maintain active fermentation. There are other organisms that spoil food and are actually dangerous, including different bacteria. But yeasts can alter the taste and texture of foods to the point of making them unsuitable for consumption. And when this happens, the growth of yeast within food products is often seen on their surfaces, as in cheeses or meats, or an old jar of jam that has remained open for too long. Appears what in everyday language we call mold. So what is it? Mold is not a type of fungus, it is a structure. One of the structures that certain fungi can form. Actually, yeasts can become visible when they proliferate and will be colloquially called mold. But biologically, this is not what they are, because mold, this structure, owes its appearance, which is dust-like with different colors, to the formation of spores. Yeasts reproduce essentially asexually, as we just said, by budding or fission, so they wouldn't produce a mat of spores. But other fungi do, fungi that are much more complex, multicellular and bigger. To understand why, we need to talk about their bodies, their structure. In most multicellular fungi, the organism takes the shape of long, branching filaments. Their way of growing is to expand this structure that can interact with the environment. This is their permanent body. Mushrooms are just temporary fruits, and the spores that sometimes become visible, because there are many, are vehicles for reproduction. They are not the fungus itself. These filaments are called hyphae, Hypha, plural hyphae, Hyphae, and each hypha is microscopic. They become visible to the naked eye only because there are many, and they are weaved together, forming cords. Each hypha is like a long chain of cells. The structure is a few cells in diameter, and this is where the chitin in the cell walls is useful. Its rigidity gives the structure its shape of filament, which is flexible but holds together. Otherwise, without chitin, it would be completely soft. Hyphae grow at their tips. New cells are added, and this is how the filaments expand. There is no nervous system in a fungus, but through mechanisms that are not fully understood, the direction of growth can be affected by the environment. For example, it has been observed that the application of an electric field could modify their development. And somehow, hyphae can also sense, detect reproductive units from some distance and grow towards them to establish contact. There is also a degree of coordination in the growth of different hyphae from the same organism. The filaments can weave through a permeable surface to penetrate it, for example. The filaments by themselves cannot move. There are no muscles, but the way they grow is not random. It responds to external stimuli. So these filaments, the hyphae, are the basic structure of most multicellular fungi and the way the organism grows. Collectively, all these tiny threads form like a root structure that is called a mycelium. Hyphae are generally transparent, and so the mycelium appears like very fine, fluffy white threads. But molds are not like that. They look generally dust-like, and they can have different colors. Why? Because of the spores. Molds become obvious and take their familiar appearance on foods or on a wall because at the end of the filaments, spores proliferate. And this is what gives the dusty texture, and also makes various molds a health hazard in case of allergy or when the spores are pathogen, because they are free to separate from the mycelium and fly around. What are spores, by the way? They look like a kind of fine dust produced by different fungi or plants like ferns, for example. But let's take a closer look at them. In biology, a spore is a unit of reproduction made for dispersal, and the type of reproduction can be sexual or asexual. In terms of function, they are like the seeds of flowering plants, but the mechanisms are different. Seeds have been fertilized, and they are already an embryo of a plant enclosed in a protective covering. Spores appeared long before seeds on Earth, and they are the step before seeds, not only in evolutionary terms, but also in the fertilization process. Flowering plants also produce spores. Pollen is a spore. But pollinization is a form of sexual reproduction. It mixes the genetic input of two individuals. Some plants can self-pollinize sometimes, but still, the embryo will be the product of two halves of genetic information. Some spores serve for sexual reproduction, but others are self-sufficient. Under favorable conditions, the spore can start dividing itself and grow into a new organism, which will be a clone of the organism that produced it. Each individual spore has few chances of fertilizing another or growing into its own organism. But plants and fungi that produce spores compensate with quantity. There are so many spores, and they are so small that they look like dust. And another way to compensate the low odds is longevity. Spores are adapted for survival, thousands of years for some of them, meaning that they might still become a new specimen centuries after the death of the organism that created them. But returning to molds, their fluffy and dust-like aspect, and their colors too, are due to this mat of spores that appears at the end of the hyphae. Molds tend to have a bad name in domestic life, and for good reasons, because they can be dangerous. On the walls they are also a symptom that humidity is excessive, that there is a lack of ventilation or cleaning. They can spoil foods too. But molds, or more exactly the fungi behind them, are vital. Why? Because they are responsible for a good part of biodegradation, which is necessary for ecosystems to last, to recycle organic material. Land vegetation, especially forests, could not be as we know them without fungi living in the ground, and to a lesser extent on trees, constantly breaking down and recombining molecules. Molds are also useful in the production of pharmaceuticals, for example antibiotics that were a game changer for modern medicine, or in the production of various pigments, foods and beverages, or to harvest their enzymes that can also serve in the chemical and pharmaceutical industries. So, I was telling you that different species of fungi produced spores at the end of their filaments, at the end of their hyphae. But as you know, others bear fruits instead. Fruits better known as mushrooms or toadstools. Why, how, and what can we say about mushrooms, which are also important to humans as a source of food, medicine, or more anecdotically, of psychoactive substances? One surprising thing with mushrooms is how fast they can grow. They sometimes seem to appear overnight, and they do, but their formation process had begun before. I already told you that the structure, the body of a multicellular fungi, the mycelium, was made of hyphae, these thin threads or filaments. In the ground or on dead matter, like a tree trunk, the hyphae form cords called mycelial cords that look similar to plant roots, and actually they have a similar function. They can carry nutrients over a long distance. In some cases that we will discuss later, fungi that act as parasites also use these courts to spread infection by growing from established clusters to uninfected parts. Like tree roots, mycelial courts can sometimes be very strong thanks to their growth. It is not frequent, but some species are able to slowly penetrate masonry with their cords of aggregated hyphae. Now, when the season is right and they have accumulated enough nutrients, some fungi will produce mushrooms as a way of disseminating their spores. Within the mycelium develops a small module no bigger than a pinhead. This pinhead is just made of interwoven hyphae, and it enlarges into a roundish structure that looks a bit like a very small egg, preparing the arrival of the mushroom. This little structure is called a button. Inside the button there is intense activity as the mushroom is forming. Sometimes it is surrounded by a veil of mycelium that protects it. As the egg expands, the veil ruptures, and depending on the species, it may remain as a cup at the base of the mushroom's stem, if there is one, or as patches on the cap. It is also the remains of this veil that may form a sort of ring around the middle of the stem, once the mushroom has popped up. When the mushroom is ready in its button, the time needed for that varies, but typically it takes around a week. The mushroom can grow very fast by just absorbing water provided by the mycelium. All the cells have already preformed, and they suddenly inflate as the mycelium injects water carried through its web of filaments. This is how the mushroom pops up so quickly. In fact, it was preformed before. It only needed to be filled with water. This is also the reason why mushrooms are short-lived and fragile. They are mainly water contained by membranes. Typically, the spores are placed under the cap, and wind or rain will help disperse them, which would have been difficult for an underground fungus. But as you know, some mushrooms are also colorful and sometimes spectacular even. Why spend energy and precious resources on a mushroom that is here to distribute spores and will exist only for a short time? This is believed to be an evolutionary feature. Bright colors attract animals that can disseminate the spores. They will come near the mushrooms or feed on them. The same explanation actually works for flowers and their scent on flowering plants. Flowers serve to attract insects that will carry their pollen to another flower of the same species. These organisms offer food and decoration to animals, and the animals inadvertently help them reproduce. Now, as you know, the bright colors of mushrooms can also be a warning sign. Mankind has used mushrooms as a source of food for a very long time, but one thing humanity learned early is that you have to be selective with them. Many species are edible, the majority actually, but it always helps to cook them before, because heat destroys several potentially poisonous compounds. There is a small number of deadly species, but more can cause severe symptoms on humans. It is supposed that the concentration of toxic compounds in mushrooms could also be an evolutionary feature, selected for some species of fungi. When the mycelium forms a mushroom, it spends considerable energy and material on it at its scale. There would be a risk that animals eat it before the mushroom expands and becomes able to disperse spores when it is still a button at the surface. Making it poisonous is either a dissuasion or a way of making the consumer vomit before digestion, so the spores are not lost. Among the toxic compounds found in dangerous mushrooms, a recurring one is amatoxin, which is lethal even in small doses, about as little as half a mushroom. Amatoxins cause damage to cells once they enter someone's system. They perforate the membranes of cells, and since they travel through the bloodstream, they reach the organs in the body. Even a small quantity of amatoxin is enough to damage the liver and heart beyond remission. So if you go mushroom hunting and are unsure about a mushroom, it is obviously always better to be on the safer side. Most of the time, poisonous mushrooms do not kill, but they can still cause a lot of damage. And wild mushrooms must always be cooked before eating. Never eat them raw. Another dangerous aspect in the longer term is that mushrooms have a propensity to absorb heavy metals, like lead or mercury, including elements that are radioactive. This is not really a concern if mushrooms are farmed and you buy them in a supermarket, because their environment is controlled. But for wild mushrooms, it can be a problem if they are consumed regularly in the long term. Now, other types of compounds found in mushrooms are less sinister and have actually been sought after in various native medicine traditions for their real or supposed healing properties. And then there is an informal group called psilocybin mushrooms, better known as magic mushrooms. These are the shrooms for short, that are sought after for their psychedelic properties. It seems they were discovered in various parts of the world during the Stone Age. Appropriate. So there is evidence of this in Africa and Europe, but they were particularly present in the Americas, North, Central and South, used in a religious or spiritual or divinatory context in indigenous cultures, where they sometimes continue to be used. Why do they have psychedelic effects? Because they contain psilocybin, a compound which, once ingested, is broken down by the liver. This is why the effect is not immediate. It takes 20-30 minutes. The resulting compound, psilocin, is responsible for the psychoactive effects. It activates the same receptors in the brain that serotonin activates. Serotonin is a complex molecule, a neurotransmitter, that plays a very important role in the regulation of various functions, including modulating mood, cognition, reward, learning, or memory. It also regulates physiological processes like vomiting or vasoconstriction, the narrowing of the blood vessels. The exact way serotonin works in our bodies is not entirely known. But what matters here is that psilocin sits in receptors of neurons that are usually activated by serotonin and activates them, which is completely unusual for our brain and produces the characteristic trip, including changes in mood, imagination, and perception that seem to come out of nowhere, since they are not induced by external stimuli. The way this substance works probably also explains why the experience can be very different from one person to the next. The experience results from the interaction of the molecule with someone's centers of perception, memory, thought processes that are very personal things. I saw a study made by the Johns Hopkins Hospital among a population of people who had consumed magic mushrooms. A third of them declared it had been the single most significant spiritual event in their life. But on the other hand, another third reported extreme anxiety caused by the experience. So it is not benign and risk-free. The use of mushrooms as a recreational drug is also illegal in many countries around the world, along with other drugs, because that's what they are. I told you earlier that fungi were also vital for trees. Sometimes they kill trees and consume them, as we saw at the beginning. But why are fungi also so important to plants? Tree roots by themselves are not very good at absorbing water and nutrients from the soil. To do it, and for trees to reach a large size, they need a symbiotic association with a group of fungi called mycorrhizal fungi. This sounds more complicated than it really is. These fungi are located inside and around the roots of plants. They colonize the tissues, and there are several thousand different species of fungi that participate in that kind of association with many different plants. Some of these fungi can only associate with one genus of plant, whereas others are generalist. They can bond with different plants. The plants that benefit from this association include eucalyptus, birch, oak, different roses, pine, orchids, and many more. It is called symbiotic because each side brings something to the other. The plants need to pump nutrients from the soil, but cannot absorb them well through the cell walls of their roots. And this is where the fungus helps. It injects nutrients, minerals, and also water that the plant needs, and it serves as a barrier too for toxic elements. For example, it has been observed that trees could survive in contaminated or acidic soils rich in metals thanks to the selection made by the fungi that live in their roots. And on the other hand, the plant feeds the fungus. Fungi cannot synthesize sugars like plants can do thanks to photosynthesis. So, as a reward for its services, the fungus is given food and shelter in the roots of the tree. For the tree, the fungus is like an extension of its roots. This symbiosis was observed in the 19th century already. It's been known for a long time. But a more recent discovery is that trees can somehow exchange signals, a form of communication that is not yet well understood. And this would work thanks to the contacts between their roots. And it seems that fungi also play a role here. Their mycelium, the web of cords, themselves made of filaments of hyphae, has this capacity to transport molecules very well. And possibly, via these molecules themselves, or their flow, to transport signals between different trees or other plants. Fossil records indicate that this association between fungi and plants is ancient, dozens of millions of years. But it is not known precisely when it began. In the current state of paleomycology, the study of fossil fungi, it is believed fungi diverged from other life around 1.5 billion years ago, at a time when, to our knowledge, only single-cell forms of life existed. And the first fungi very probably stayed single cell for hundreds of millions of years. They would have evolved from a bacteria ancestor, and for a long time they would have stayed purely aquatic. The oldest undisputed fossils of terrestrial fungi are dated from about 400 million years ago, during a period called the Ordovician, known to be a moment when life forms suddenly became more diverse and complex. When I say suddenly, it is on a geological scale. We are still speaking of several million years. But it could have been before, during the Cambrian, that they colonized the Earth. The Cambrian was another period of quick life expansion or radiation, or maybe even before the Cambrian. A doubt exists because fossils that look a lot like fungi have been dated to as early as 635 million years ago. But it is unsure whether they were already terrestrial fungi or something else. Fungi do not fossilize well. They cannot biomineralize. That is to say, to have their cellular structure replaced by minerals and become rock. Biomineralization is the phenomenon that gives the best fossils. So the fossil record for fungi is relatively small and contains prints rather than 3D single-cell fungi. It doesn't help to study their ancient forms. Fossils become better later when fungi gained in size and formed a mycelium. In any case, they adapted very well to land life, and they grew to impressive sizes during the Devonian. As I told you at the beginning, they could form structures comparable to trees in size. This makes specialists believe that they dominated the land before photosynthetic plants did, or at least were already one of the dominant life forms when plants colonized the land. It is hard to imagine that fungi could have thrived alone on land. Because a constant of their nature is that they cannot produce their own food. They live on existing organic matter. So somehow they had to follow plants on the continents rather than precede them. But they could have lived in wet soils on the Earth's continent long before large animals arrived. And interestingly, because they only need food to survive and conditions of temperature and humidity that are bearable, it has been observed that they did not collapse with other forms of life during extinction events. They could even have thrived during them, or some of them. For example, it has been observed that the evidence of fossil fungi suddenly increased approximately 66 million years ago, during the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction. This one is the mass extinction that killed off most dinosaurs and many other species. An explanation to this is that Earth could have turned into a massive compost pile with all this organic matter available and no predator to control the population of fungi. So for a period of time, a few thousands of years maybe, there would have been a fungus boom while countless species of animals and plants disappeared. I told you of the symbiotic relationship with plants, but it is not the only form of mutualistic relationship fungi are engaged in. Another one is with insects. Several groups of ants and termites are known to cultivate fungi. And they do it for several purposes, as a food source and also as a structural component of their nests. There are also insects like wood wasps and at least one species of stingless bee that have included fungi in their reproduction cycle. When they lay eggs or leave larvae behind, they let them with spores or developed fungi in a new place. The fungus will provide food to the larvae, but will not be entirely consumed. So on the one hand, it helps the insect species reproduce successfully, and on the other hand, this association disseminates the fungi or their spores to new places. Yet another form of association is with algae and bacteria able to photosynthesize. This association gives lichen. Lichen are almost everywhere on Earth and come in a variety of colors and shapes. They could be mistaken for plants, but they are not. They are composite organisms in which algae or bacteria live in a mutualistic relationship with a fungus, forming what could be seen as a tiny self-contained ecosystem. They produce their own food by photosynthesis, and the fungus offers a protective structure, a medium where its tiny single-cell hosts can live and multiply. So lichens have no roots, which is why they can grow almost on any surface. They just need air and light. When they grow on trees, they are not parasites. They use the trunk as a surface, a substrate, or sometimes the branches. In rainforests or temperate woodland, they sometimes hang from branches. There are other cases when the relationship fungi establish is not mutualistic, but rather parasitic. They feed on the organism they live in. For agriculture, the most devastating of them is a species called the rice blast fungus. It is a plague to the cultivation of rice and can also attack other cereals. It is estimated that it destroys a quantity of rice that could feed 60 million people each year. There are also carnivorous fungi that capture tiny worms, nematodes. Of course, they cannot actively hunt them because they don't move, but they use a kind of passive hunting technique. They form constricting rings or sticky nets with their hyphae that make the nematode unable to move, after which they digest it with their enzymes. And fungi can be parasites of other fungi. Among the tens of thousands of known species, a large variety of strategies to survive exist. They can go as far as becoming a parasite to insects, eating them from inside and controlling their body with their cords that grow inside the animal, turning it into a walking dead. This is fairly rare and does not last very long, because eventually the host will decompose and the fungus doesn't have muscles. It sounds and looks rather sinister, but it is a brilliant survival strategy to feed and gain mobility at the same time. There would be many more things to say about fungi. We just scratched the surface. But as usual, this was intended as an introduction that hopefully makes you want to know more. So we have reached the end of our story for tonight, and you can now let go and fall asleep. Or, if you prefer, pick another story from my library. I'll be back soon with a new one. And in the meantime, sleep well. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.